Welcome to another video by LSX Engines Tuning and Marine. In this video I'm installing pistons in a Mercruiser 4.3 liter V6, and I'm installing the pistons with a new ring compressor I bought. I'm trying it out, so there'll be a product review in this associated with this video. But once I install the piston with the bearing on the rod, I'm checking the bearing clearance with plastic gauge, and I've just done number one, and you can see there's the plastic gauge. So number one plastic gauge is reading between, it's wider than 0.002 and narrower than 0.0015. So that means the bearing clearance is less than 0.002 but greater than 0.0015. And I'm adding a thousandth of an inch, half a thousandth of an inch clearance because this is a high performance, high revving motor. So the clearance, acceptable clearance, well, let me back up. The color manual, which I'll put at the end of this video, excerpt from the online color manual for 4.3 engines, industrial engines, says the clearance is, I think, 0.001 to 0.00. It's odd. The service clearance is less than the production clearance. I don't understand that, but I'm going to go with the service clearance. The service clearance is 0.001 to 0.002. I'm adding a half a thousandth to it, so I'm allowed to go up to 0.0025. So this bearing is within that tolerance. So this bearing is good. So I'm going to go ahead and scrape this plastic edge off, oil the bearing, and button this one up and move on to the next cylinder, which would be cylinder number 2. This is cylinder number 1. So I'm going to do that. I'm not going to show installation of all these pistons. Once I get 1 and 2 in, I'll probably show the installation of the piston on piston number 3. So stay tuned for that. Continuing with the installation of the pistons, this is piston number 2 and rod bearing number 2, and I'm checking the bearing clearance with plastic gauge. And once again, you can see that the clearance is, let me see if I can get a good view of this. It is slightly wider than 0.002, barely, and definitely not as wide as 0.0015. So the clearance on this bearing is a little under 0.002. So that bearing is acceptable. All right, there's the second one. All right, continuing number 3. Continuing with the installation of pistons in this Mercruiser 4.3 V6. I'm working on piston number 3 now, and I've got the bearing plastic gauged. And as you can see, the clearance is just a tad wider. Well, to me, it looks almost right on the money on 0.002. All right, continuing with the installation of the pistons. I've got 3 pistons in, and I've only torqued the bolts down to 20 foot-pounds, what they call the first pass, because I only had my inch-pounds torque wrench with me, and my larger torque wrench was left at home, so I'm now back. And so the second pass is supposed to be 70 degrees from the 20 foot-pounds position. So I've got what's called an angle, not an angle torque meter, but I'm not sure what it's called. But anyway, it measures degrees past initial point. So I've got this this bar here, so it touches there, and then you set this for 0. Once this is touching your stop, you set that for 0, and then you torque. So 70 degrees is right there at the tip of my finger. 60, 70, 80, 90. So 70 is right there. So when I use this thing, I look at where I want to be, where I want to end up, and I don't focus on anything else but watching that needle right there stop on that point right there. Right there on that long tick mark right there. So what I do is I hold the stop against the metal like that so it doesn't move. And then I'll grab a hold of the end of my torque wrench, and I put tension on it and just make sure I'm still at 0. If it moves, I'll reset it and set it back to 0 with tension on it. And once I have tension on it, when I say tension, I'm not pulling on it hard, I'm just trying to keep the slack out. And then I pull on the torque wrench until it reads around to 70 degrees. So what I like to do is set the torque wrench to where it doesn't click right before 70. And then if I were to pull a little harder, it would click. So I'm just trying to get a feel for how much torque I'm putting on it. And right now I've got this torque wrench set for 55 foot-pounds. So if I've already done those 2, and that's how I narrowed it down to 55 foot-pounds. I'm gonna do these next 4. And if 55 foot-pounds seems to be the right number, then you might could say, well, you could torque them down without this device to 55 foot-pounds, because that seems consistently what it takes. In the past of building motors like this, Chevy 350s, which these rods are similar to, I've always, I think 45 foot-pounds was the old value back in the, when I used to build motors back in the 90s and so forth. But they may have changed bolts, I don't know, but I'm going by 70 degrees, which is what the book says. So I'm about to tighten these 4 bolts to 70 degrees, not 70 foot-pounds, 70 degrees from 0. And by the way, you can do this in one step. You can't torque it down half and then stop and then come back and do it, then do the other bolt and go back. Once you start from 0, you've got to go to 70. You can't do this in stages. So like I say, the first pass of 20 foot-pounds gets you your first stage. Your second stage is all the way to 70 from there. So about to do 4 more bolts to 70, and then I'll put the other 3 pistons in. Now installing piston number 4, and if you recall at the start of this video, I stated that this was going to be a sort of a product review, and so the first 3 pistons that I put in this engine, I used what's called a tapered ring compressor. It's a piece of anodized aluminum, and it's one piece, and it's designed for only one size piston. That's 4.030 inches, which these are. And the way it works is, so it's kind of a conical shaped device, and the top is narrower than the bottom. See the rim there, it's narrow, and then the rim on the bottom is thicker. And so the concept is you put your piston down in it, and the rings, as you push the piston down through, the rings compress down to the final size, and then they going into the cylinder. I found that it wasn't quite as smooth as I thought it would be. So I did 3 pistons, and I wasn't super impressed. I mean, it worked, but this is my other ring compressor, and I'm about to put number 4 in, just trying to give myself a feel of which one's better. So these are the traditional style ring compressors, made out of like a long sheet of metal that's folded around on itself and overlaps. You can see how it overlaps right there. And it's got this ratcheting band system that tightens it up and squeezes down on the rings. So I've used this in the past forever, and it's always worked, but I thought maybe this other device, thought maybe this would go faster, but I wasn't really impressed with it, so I think I wasted about $38 on this device. But I'll leave that. I'll do the last 2 pistons, or last 3 pistons with the this style ring compressor, and then I'll try to make my final judgment. So when I install a piston, this is number 4, I orient the rings a certain way. So let me see. So the front of the piston's got the notch. There's a nut. I mean, either dot or nuts. That's the front of the piston. And by the way, you can see the part number of these pistons right there in case you were curious. H423 DCP, H640 DCP. Talked about that at length on other videos. So anyway, what I do, so the pistons feels the most thrust forces on this face and that face, because that's the side that goes up and down and rocks back and forth in the bore. So I try not to put gaps, ring gaps, in either in this area, or that area if I can help it. I try to put more. So my second ring gap I put over here, right here. First ring gap put right there, and I kind of stagger the oil ring gaps here and here, and then the gap between the expander doesn't really matter, I don't think. So here you go. So I stagger out my gaps so that you don't want to have your top ring gap and your second ring gap line up on top of each other. That's a straight path to loose compression gases. You want it to have to go past the first ring and work its way around to the other corner to get out. So that's my philosophy anyway. And I think I read that a long time ago, but I don't know where I saw it. So what I've done is, what I do is I take about a cap, 3/4 of a cap of oil from an oil bottle, and I pour maybe, I don't know, equivalent about 5 or 6 drops of oil. I turn the piston sideways and pour oil on the rings. Pour about 5 or 10 drops of oil into the rings, and then I rub it around the piston all the way around with my finger. You see I have all these rings all the way around, okay? And I don't smear it on the top, and I smear a little bit on the side wall of the piston, on the coated part, just to get it kind of wet. I don't really put a glob of oil on there, just enough to coat it and get it wet with oil. Then I place the piston in the hole, and then the next step is I take my ring compressor and I put it down over the piston like so. I can get this thing out with one hand. So, and then you push down on it to make sure it's kind of flush with the block, okay? Then you tighten it up, not all the way, but you snug it up. Don't squeeze the piston all the way, but snug it up to where you've compressed the rings. And then I reach in from underneath and I push the piston back up inside the compressor I'd say about a quarter of an inch. And once I get it up in the air, if the piston falls back down on its own, your compressor's too loose. You need to tighten it up. So I tighten it up to where when I push the piston up a quarter of an inch, it stays up there from friction, all right? And then I continue to tighten this compressor until I wouldn't say as tight as I go, but I snug it up pretty good to where I know it's compressing those rings. But it's still, if I were to take a wooden handle, a hammer handle and tap here, the piston would move down. You don't want to tighten it up so tight that the piston won't budge. So once I've got it that tight, I know it's ready to slide on down into the cylinder. Now the key critical thing you need to watch for is to make sure there's no gap between the bottom of that ring compressor and the deck of the block right there. You cannot have a gap. If you see light or if you see a ring, you got to start over because your ring popped out. So you go around, you go around the whole circumference of this thing, looking at it before you finally push it in, make sure there's no gaps. And I keep my palm kind of on the top to keep it flush, keep the whole ring compressor flush with the block. And then I take a wooden handle, the end of a wooden handle hammer, and just lightly tap that piston down. If it resists and is hard to go, so you're doing something wrong. It should slide right on in pretty smooth. So, I mean, it doesn't just slide in on its own, but you got to tap it. But I'm just saying it doesn't offer a whole lot of resistance. So that's how I get pistons in with this type ring compressor. And once the piston drops in the hole and gets below the deck of the block, the ring compressor just comes off. It falls away because there's nothing holding it there anymore. Then what you got to do is you got to loosen your compressor back up to get it back expanded for the next piston. And so it's pretty easy to do. So in hindsight, I'm not really sure why I bought that other device since this is so easy, but I want to see if it worked better and was faster, but it really wasn't. The main drawback to this device is that since it doesn't have a slot or a hole, you've got to put the piston in through it first before you put the piston in that hole. You can't put this over the top of it because it's too narrow, obviously. And obviously it doesn't go upside down. So you have to put the piston in this device first and then set the piston in the hole. And so what that means is your rings must fit down within this conical section first so that you have something, the piston sticking out the bottom for it to find the hole. Otherwise there's nothing for it to slide into. Or the piston acts as the guide to center this device over the hole because once the piston is sticking out below the surface here. But again, I just wasn't impressed. Maybe other people like them, but my review of this thing is that it wasn't worth the money I paid for it. And the box was, let me see if I want to put the box. I don't see it. I'll find the box later and show it to you and put it at the end of the video. But anyway, it's called a tapered ring compressor. And again, not impressed. So at this time, I'm going to go ahead and push this piston down in, and then I'll show you a video how I button it up on the other side. I've already got a bearing cap in there. And I'll do one more piston and show you how I prep the piston to go in the hole before I do all this stuff. So stay tuned. All right, showing you the bottom part of piston number 4. I've flipped the motor upside down. And this is number 4 piston pushed all the way down to the bearing shell that's inside the rod. Meets with the crank. I then place a piece of plastic gauge across there, and I'm about to put the bearing cap over that and torque it down to see what my bearing clearance is. All right, this is the rod bearing on number 4, and as you can see, there is a little bit of taper to this. It's about 0.00, it's a little less than 0.002. There's the clearance is slightly larger than 0.002 on this end and almost close to 0.0015 on this end. So there's some taper in this journal. I'll check the book specs after I close this video and see if that's acceptable. But it looks like it's, I don't know, about maybe half a thousandths worth of taper. I'm not sure. So once I stop the video, I'll examine this and compare it to specs and see if this is acceptable. All right, continuing number 4. After looking at the specs, the max taper for service is 1/1000th of an inch. And after examining the previous video, I think I was approximately, using my eye extrapolation capability, it looked like the clearance was about 0.0022 on the narrow end and 0.01718 on the wider end. So that comes out to approximately 0.0005 or half a thousandth of taper, which is within spec. So I'm going to declare this acceptable. All right, I'm going to scrape the plastic edge off, cap, oil this bearing, and put the cap back on, put the nuts on, torque it down, and move on to number 5. All right, I'm now about to install piston number 6. I'll skip 5 because of the way the crank is. It's getting harder to rotate, so it's easier to stop on 6. So I'm about to prep piston number 6 for installation. And so what I do is, first thing I do is I take the piston. These already been prepped, by the way, with rings. Every one of them have the rings on them, like I explained in the last video. So anyway, I take the cap off the rod, put it there. I put the 2 nuts near my engine so I can find them. And I always keep track of which nut goes where. What I do is I like to say, okay, so there's the front of the piston. If I put it upside down, the front's facing forward. So the nut closest to me goes, for example, the nut closest to me right now is the one closest to, is just the one closest to the right side of the motor. And then the other one is the farthest one away from me when I'm putting these in. So the bottom line is I just orient the nuts so I can keep track of which bolt they came off of. Maybe you don't have to. I've been doing it my whole life that way, and I've made them superstitious. I don't know. It's just how I do it. So anyway, I've now got a bare rod. So I wipe this saddle out with a clean cloth. Wipe that out. And even though it's clean, I wipe it again so it could have dust settle in. Wipe it out. Take a bearing shell, wipe the bearing shell off on both sides, the inside, the outside, and the edges. Even though they're brand new and came out of a box, came out of that box right there, they could still have manufacturing dust or dust from sitting on the shelf for a while. So I clean the bearings off, wipe them off with a clean shop cloth, and then I put one bearing cap or one bearing shell in the rod here, and then I use these rubber sleeves I made, and I put them on the bolt like so, like that, to keep the it serves 2 purposes. 1, it keeps the bearing shell from falling out, and 2, it helps guide the rod bolts down without hitting the crankshaft and nicking it, so that it's a protector for the crankshaft. And what I do is I put a little cut a little like a little half moon notch off the side of it, because when you push this on here, and by the way, these things have a curvature to them. I don't know if you see the curvature in it. So the curvature, you want the sleeve to kind of, when it's on the rod, you want it to kind of bend away from the crank, so it kind of helps guide it on there and guide the crank down into the rod. But you want to cut this little notch out so that it doesn't create a pinch point between the rubber and the crankshaft, because it will pinch off a little bit of rubber if you don't have that on there. So I made 2 of these rubber sleeves. And when I'm done with them, I'm keep in a plastic bag to keep them clean, keep dust and stuff off of them. Even though I wash them every time, I keep them in a bag, keep them clean so they don't stay clean between bills. Okay, continuing with the installation of pistons and plastic gauging the connecting rod journal or connecting rod bearings. This is number 6, and you can see this one's also got some taper. So on the narrow side, it's got about 0.002 inches clearance. Looks to be right on the money. 0.002 inches clearance on one side. And then when I move to the other side, it widens up to about 0.0015. Pretty close on the money. So halfway between those two, let me see if I can get a better picture for you. There you go. So, but the bottom line is the difference from one side to the other is a half a thousandth. So this taper is acceptable. All right, last piston. This is piston number 5. As I stated before, I prep them by putting the bearing shell in, putting these rubber sleeves on there to hold the bearing shell in and to protect the crank. Place it in the hole, and I set it in there until I'm ready to oil it. So let me see if I can get this back in there, one-handed. Okay, so it's just sitting in there now. It's not going to go down because the rings are not compressed. So At this time, I take the cap to an oil can or oil jug and fill it 3/4 way with oil, and I put about 10 drops of oil on the. Let me show you this. So I pull the piston out. Swap hands here. So pull the piston out, hold it sideways like this, put about 10 drops of oil right on there. Let it run down the sides a little bit. Hold it with my left hand, then smear the oil all over the rings with my right hand, with my finger. Wrap it all the way around the piston. It might spill on the floor a little bit, it's okay. But I just basically kind of coat the rings and the side and then the coated part of the piston, but I don't gob it on there. And then once I do that, I put it back in the hole temporarily. And so in the case of this piston, I'm going to use this other ring expander I was telling you about. And I can't do it. I can't show on camera because I have to use. It's a major 2-end deal. So I pull the piston back out of the hole, put it down inside this device, and then kind of work the ring, wobble it back and forth in a kind of a circular motion to get all the rings down inside this upper part of this red thing is tapered, until you want a little bit, maybe about that much of the bottom of the piston sticking out of the bottom of here. Then once you get this on there, that's what guides you to get this piston into the hole. The bottom half of the piston, or the bottom, I don't know, about 1 inch of the piston sticking out the bottom of this to put you in the hole. Once you get in the hole, hold this down flush, and then you just push the piston through. And it gets tighter and tighter, and I don't know, it kind of feels rough to me. It works. Then I have to take a wooden handle hammer and I tap on the top of the piston until I tap it down through. And it feels kind of iffy whether it's going through or not. I did 3 pistons with this thing yesterday and it worked. I wasn't impressed. I'm gonna give it one more shot. Compared to the other compressor, this was a colossal waste of money, to be honest with you. But I'm gonna give it a shot and show you how it works. When I get the piston in here and get it ready to tap down, I'll show you the process of when it tap it down. You see what it's like. All right, I've got the tapered ring compressor in place, and now it's sitting on top of the block, and the piston sticking out past the compressor about, I don't know, 1/2 inch, 3/4 inch, and that's what's kind of keeping it over the hole. So as I push this down, you can hear it. The edge of this aluminum has a little bit of a ridges to it, so that's why it makes that scratchy sound. But as I push this thing down in there, you can see that it's getting harder and harder to push. All right, the piston's in, and it got down to where I think the ring is just barely touching this top of the deck here. And at that point, I had to take the hammer and tap it on down in with the wooden handle. And I don't know, at first it kind of resisted, but it went on down through, and I tapped it on in, it worked. Again, it works. Was it worth $38? No. I would have been happy to keep using the old ring compressor. It worked just fine. I don't really think it sped things up any, and to me, my process worked just as fine the old way. So, oh, by the way, I told you I'd show you the package. This is the product. It's called Proform Engine Building Tools, part 67-445 tapered ring compressor, 4.03 inch bore. And they make an adjustable one for any from 4 inch all the way up to 4.060. I started to buy that one, but what I really wanted was a one-piece device where it didn't take much to clean it, but it's just not worth the money, in my opinion. You can buy one and try it yourself, but I'll be using this old style ring compressor, and I might just give that away to somebody, or let somebody else build another engine with me, and so I'll have 2 of them. But anyway, that's the end of the videos for installing pistons. I now have all 6 pistons in. I'm going to push that piston on down, flip it over, attach the rod bearing to it. Well, I'm going to check it with a plastic gauge first, check the clearance, button it up, and then all 6 pistons will be in on this engine. Let me make a comment about oiling. You saw me, I smeared a little oil kind of on the rings and on the side of the piston, but I don't gob it on there. In the old days, I used to take a coffee can, put oil in it, and I would dip the piston upside down completely into the coffee can to submerge the rings in the top of the piston, and it just made a mess. It just got everywhere. It wasn't really, it was overkill, I think. So what I try to do when I build engines is, I oil them, but I keep the oil to a minimum so I don't make a mess. And because once you start getting a mess, and then the dirt and on everything starts sticking to the oil, and you got a problem on your hands. So I try to minimize the amount of oil I put on things. And once I button this all up, and before I put the heads on, I will work each piston down. They slide okay for now. Obviously, they probably need a little more oil, but so I put them all to where each piston is about halfway down its bore, and then I smear the bore with oil with my finger and to oil up the sides of the bore, and then I turn it one full turn to make sure all the pistons have been gone through the oil. So I think that's adequate for startup, and as long as you don't hear any major gouging or something, it's okay. So like I said, I try to keep the oiling to the when I build engines, I keep the oil mess to a minimum. Because I don't like the mess. Okay, I'm now showing the plastic gauge on bearing number 5, or journal number 5. And as you can see, it is, let me get a little bit there. So it's a little bit wider than 0.002 and not as wide as 0.005. So it's somewhere less than, I would say it's 0.0018 if I had to guess. By the way, the rod bearing partner I'm using for this rebuild, this Mercruiser 4.3 V6 rebuild with the rod journals turned 10 thousandths under size, is 1020 CP or 0.25 millimeter. 0.25 millimeter is 10,000th of an inch undersize.